in the dry heart of the American West, where sandstone burns red beneath a merciless sun. The ground still remembers every strike of a hammer, a century and a half ago. This wilderness became a battlefield not for land or gold, but for bones. Fossils were the treasure, and reputation was the weapon. The newspapers of the 1870s called it the Bone Wars, a rivalry between two brilliant scientists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. Their feud would reshape paleontology forever, uncovering dozens of new species and cementing America as the capital of dinosaur discovery. But beneath their names, beneath the telegrams, insults, and frantic expeditions lay another story. A story of the nameless ones, the field diggers, mule drivers, and lonely scouts who labored under punishing heat and blizzards, who bled and sometimes died for discoveries that others claimed. They were the ghosts of the Bone Wars, the forgotten hands behind the glory. The year was 1870. In a small Colorado town named Morrison, a group of railroad workers struck something strange, massive bones embedded in stone. They sent word east, and within weeks, two men arrived, Marsh of Yale and Cope of Philadelphia. At first, they were allies, even friends, two intellectuals chasing the same dream. But pride breeds poison. Cope once misassembled a fossil, putting the skull on the tail. Marsh never let him forget it. What began as friendly competition turned to open war. They bribed each other's assistance, sabotaged shipments, and raced to name every fossil before the other. Marsh had Yale's fortune and political influence. Cope had speed and obsession. They dug in Wyoming, Colorado, and Kansas, dispatching crews that worked in secrecy and fear. By 1890, both men had uncovered more than 140 new dinosaur species: Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, Diplodocus, Triceratops, but their feud had destroyed their reputations. Behind every headline was another man's labor. Behind every discovery, another man's grave. For every Marsh or Cope, there were 50 nameless workers. They came from mines, farms, and railroad crews, men who knew the taste of dust better than fame. Paid a few dollars a week, they carried crates heavier than themselves across miles of desert. William Reed, Marsh's trusted foreman, recorded days that read like battle diaries. Wind all day, broke 3 chisels, packed 1 vertebra at dusk. Coyotes watching. In the evenings, the men ate beans by lantern light, mending torn hands with whiskey and rag. When the wind blew right, the sound of hammers echoed like gunfire across the Badlands. George Sternberg, who would later become a fossil legend in his own right, once wrote, "We sleep among bones older than sin. The professor owns the glory. We carry the weight." One surviving letter from a laborer reads simply, "The bones go east. The money goes missing. The nights are colder than the stone." It was science born from suffering, a war waged not in laboratories, but in trenches of shale. Mini extension, a day in the quarry. Dawn came with frost on the tents and the hiss of boiling coffee. Men woke stiff and silent, their boots frozen solid. By noon, the sun roasted the rock face until the air shimmered. Hammers struck in rhythm, thunk, pause, breath. When a bone emerged, someone whispered, "Find," and the camp went quiet. Even the wind held still as plaster wrapped around ancient stone. That moment, brief and fragile, was their cathedral. To dig fossils in the 19th century was to gamble against death. The western plains hid flash floods, rattlesnakes, and sudden storms that tore camps apart. Explosives were crude but common, and one wrong charge could bury a man alive. An 1880 Udmont journal mentions a rock slide that crushed a worker near Como Bluff. He fell with his hammer still in hand. We buried him in shale. No one spoke his name again. Diseases struck faster than shovels could move. Typhoid, heat stroke, And infected wounds took more lives than science ever counted. Still, men kept coming because each bone promised a kind of immortality. In those days, paleontology was not a profession. It was a calling that demanded everything and offered nothing. By the mid-1880s, paleontology had become entertainment. Railroads sponsored digs. Newspapers printed sensational stories about American dragons. In Denver and New York, public exhibitions displayed half-assembled skeletons to cheering crowds. Cope and Marsh competed not only for fossils, but for spectacle. Their discoveries became weapons of prestige. Cope's mansion filled with bones stacked to the ceiling, while Marsh hoarded his fossils in Yale's storerooms, often forgetting where half were kept. The men in the field knew what this meant. One wrote bitterly, "The fossils are currency. We mine for pride, not for truth." Mini extension, science as circus. At some camps, reporters were invited to watch. They called it the show. Children clapped as fossilized ribs were hoisted from rock like carnival prizes. Railroad owners posed for photographs beside bones they hadn't found. For the diggers, it was humiliation wrapped in applause. What had begun as discovery had turned into theater science on display, stripped of soul. When money tightened, Marsh refused to pay his workers. Some buried fossils out of spite. Others sold fragments to private collectors. The field became a chessboard of betrayal. Every spade of earth was another move in a game no one could win. Then came nature's revenge. In 1895, Cope's Philadelphia laboratory caught fire. Flames devoured his life's work, hundreds of fossils, thousands of notes, irreplaceable field drawings. Witnesses said bones cracked like gunfire as plaster jackets burst in the heat. That same year, a flood swept through the Denver yards where Marsh's crates were waiting for rail transport. Dozens of barrels split open, vertebrae and skulls tumbling into the current. Locals reported bones glinting in the moonlight, spinning downriver toward oblivion. No one knows how many specimens were lost, perhaps thousands. But the real loss was context, the precise layer, the coordinates, the story each fossil once told. Without records, the data was dead. The Bone Wars had burned its own history to ash. The war's ugliest battles were fought in ink and silence. Cope bribed Marsh's men to leak site maps. Marsh retaliated by blacklisting defectors from museum work. Trust dissolved like dust in rain. William Reed, loyal to Marsh for years, was accused of theft when fossils went missing. Though innocent, he was never rehired. Another assistant sold false site coordinates to both sides, then vanished into the desert. Cope grew paranoid. "Even my diggers are spies," he wrote in 1889. Marsh became secretive, hiring detectives to shadow his own employees. And in 1880, Charles Landis, a scout owed 3 months' pay, disappeared. Months later, his body was found near Como Bluff, his notebook clutched in one hand. Inside were sketches of a skeleton no one has ever rediscovered. By the time the century turned, most of these men were gone. Only their handwriting remains, fading on old tags tied to bones now displayed in glass cases. Across Wyoming's Badlands and Colorado's bluffs, their camps decay under wind and snow. Sometimes hikers find shards of plaster, rusted chisels, or splintered crates marked Yale 1881. In 2009, park rangers uncovered a shallow grave near Como Bluff. A corroded tag bore the letters J.W., Yale Crew. Beside it lay a rusted tin cup and a belt buckle stamped with a star. Whoever he was, he rests within sight of the quarry that yielded Diplodocus. Mini extension, the modern searchers. In 2022, a University of Wyoming team used ground-penetrating radar to map old camp sites. They found remnants of fire pits, nails, and a small lead pencil engraved C.L., perhaps Charles Landis himself. Each artifact, however small, adds humanity to history. These weren't ghosts. They were men who shaped the foundation of science with sweat and silence. Today, local historians mark these forgotten graves with simple stones, no statues, no plaques, only coordinates logged and shared with museums. A century later, the desert is still their keeper. The Bone Wars ended not with victory, but exhaustion. By 1897, Cope lay dying, nearly bankrupt, yet unrepentant. He willed his own skeleton to science, as if daring Marsh to outdo him one last time. Marsh followed 2 years later, alone in a New Haven apartment surrounded by dust-covered fossils. Their feud gave paleontology its foundation, but also its conscience. In the decades that followed, new rules emerged: standardized cataloging, site documentation, field ethics. Institutions like the Smithsonian, Carnegie, and American Museum of Natural History vowed never again to repeat the chaos. And yet, the lessons came from loss. For every gleaming Allosaurus in a museum, a nameless worker had died to free it. For every species listed, 100 stories went untold. Science survived, but humanity was the price. Walk today through any great museum, Carnegie, Yale, Smithsonian, and you'll see the trophies of that war towering above you. Beneath soft lighting and Latin names, they stand like cathedrals of stone. Children stare in awe. Guides recite dates and discoveries. But listen closely, and you'll hear what the plaques don't say. The faint echoes of picks striking rock, the laughter of men around a dying campfire, the silence of a grave unmarked. Mini extension, the museum scene. A janitor polishes the marble floor as closing time approaches. The hall grows quiet. Light from the skylight shifts across the skull of a Diplodocus. For a moment, it looks alive. Beneath it lies a brass tag, collected 1883. No mention of who, no tribute, only time and dust. If you stand long enough, you'll sense it, the breath of the desert still clinging to those bones. They remember every hand that touched them, every storm that nearly took them back.